Thank you, Ian, and thank you all for being here. I'm confident that the turn in the weather has something to do with the good turnout here. It's just not spring-like at all, even though we are in April. I'm very happy to be here, especially happy because my flight up from Boston yesterday was eventful. We tried twice to land at the Billy Bishop Airport on the island, and both times the plane was chattering and it felt like we were going to go straight down, and the stewardess announced with an almost eerie calm, the pilot has decided that the conditions are not optimal for a safe landing, which she didn't need to tell us. We were quite clear on that. So we came here actually to Hamilton and landed, and I hoped they could just let me hop off the plane, but they wouldn't, and so we flew back to Toronto, and the pilot announced with, again, that same eerie calm, I've been in touch with air traffic control, and I'm told that several of the planes that are circling have landed successfully. And as we approached the airport, I really was expecting, as the clouds opened, maybe 20 feet from the ground, to see the other airplanes that hadn't successfully landed floating in the water. But we did make it, and I was struck by the difference between that Canadian crowd and the crowd that would have been on a U.S. airline. There was no groaning, there was no grumbling, there were no shrieks. Once that pilot had announced that a few of the planes had landed, in the United States, people would have been clamoring to get off. There would have been chaos. But I was struck, as I reflected on it, that the qualities that Canadians demonstrated, which are qualities I've admired for years, are the qualities that democracy requires. And what I want to try to do tonight is explain to you why I think that's true. You've had people talking about the rise of fascism. You're going to have someone visit to talk about the coming crisis that is being occasioned by the rise of the radical right in the United States. In the last couple of weeks, I've heard Jane Mayer, who's the author of a book called Dark Money, talk about the way in which the far right has come to power in the United States. I heard another, actually former student of mine, Chris Adelson, who teaches at American University, talk about the way authoritarianism has taken hold in the United States. It seems to me that most of the discussion in the last few years has been about the radical right and about the threat that it poses to democracy. But it seems to me that there hasn't been as much attention paid to the question of how democracy developed or how democracy took root. We more or less take for granted democracy. And the purpose of my book, which was published before the current incumbent was elected in the United States, was to trace the process by which this idea of self-government, or self-rule, as I call it in the subtitle of the book, went from being a scandal, an idea that no one would take seriously, to the form of government that is now more popular than any other in the world. And that is quite a striking phenomenon. But it's also quite a recent phenomenon. It happens only in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so what I set out to do in Toward Democracy was to explain how democracy had moved from the fringe of political debate and as an outlier, really, considering the possibilities of government, to the center. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. This presentation will have two parts. First, I want to talk about what I think democracy requires, what I think the conditions are that make possible the emergence of democracy. And then after talking about that for a few minutes, I want to run through the very long story of the history of democracy that I tell in the book. But before I get into either of those, I want to play a little word association game with you. What's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word democracy? Just what immediately pops into your head?
Freedom.
Freedom, okay. Equality. Choice. Greece, okay. Anything else? Fair, okay. Freedom, equality, Greece, fair. Representation, okay.
Opportunity.
All right. Opportunity, okay. All right, all good. Okay, I want to suggest that all of those are central parts of the story of democracy, but that they don't fit together quite as neatly as we might think initially that they do. I argue that there are three different dimensions to democracy. The first is the one that I think everybody is aware of, and those are the institutions of democracy. You need to have constitutional government with the rule of law. Right? Secondly, you need to have some form of electing representatives, where you said representative democracy, whether that is elections, as it usually is, or lottery, which is how we choose juries in the United States, and I assume how you choose juries in Canada as well. And from the ancient world, there was a kind of blending of sortition, as they called it, or lottery, with election. And the third of these institutional requirements seems to me to be majority rule. You can't just have some small group deciding on what's going to happen. It needs to be the will of the majority that is expressed. In addition to these institutions, though, democracies, I think, have to be oriented toward a certain set of goals, or what I call the principles of democracy. And there are three of these as well. You can tell I have a good Trinitarian education. There are three of these. The first is popular sovereignty. The idea that all authority has to come from the people. It doesn't come from another source. It comes from the will of the people. The second I call autonomy, and one of you said, it's actually several of you said freedom. I prefer the word autonomy because autonomy means self-rule. It means the internalizing of rules, whereas freedom can suggest simply doing whatever you feel like doing. Or do whatever I damn well please. That's what it means to be free. But in a democracy, you have to be willing to be bounded by the law so that you can't necessarily do whatever you want to do. And the third, as some of you noted, is equality. The problem is that these ideas are not necessarily either clear or consistent with each other. They are all what the political science folks call essentially contested concepts. And you can see that just by taking a single, simple example. In any group of three who have power, they exercise popular sovereignty, you can find a majority of two committed to enslaving the other one. So you've got majority rule, you've got popular sovereignty, you've got equality, everybody gets a vote, but you don't have autonomy, because that one person who is enslaved has to make reference to the principle of freedom or autonomy to contrast the principle of equality and popular sovereignty. So always in a democracy, you have to have a balance among competing principles that don't necessarily nest with each other as easily as we'd like to think they do. The third dimension of democracy, and this is where I think many of the discussions of democracy that I see are lacking, has to do with what I call the cultural preconditions of democracy, or the pillars on which I think democracy has to stand. The first of these is deliberation. In order to come to a conclusion, even if it's a provisional conclusion, in a democracy, that has to come as a result of a give and take of arguments, rather than simply a proclamation from on high. It has to emerge through interaction of people with different points of view. The second is pluralism. Unless you see diversity as a strength rather than a weakness, you're unlikely to value either equality or freedom, and you're unlikely to include people other than yourself or people like you in the body politic, among those who would be exercising popular sovereignty. And finally, and from my point of view, most important, is what I call the ethic of reciprocity. What I mean by that is the willingness to see things from the point of view of the person who disagrees with you, to try on that way of looking at the world, and to try imaginatively to enter into the ways of thinking and being that people who oppose you on political or social or cultural questions might have. Unless you have that ethic of reciprocity, why on earth would you allow your worst enemy to govern if she wins an election? It's that inclination to allow your enemy to govern that undergirds all of those institutions, that undergirds those principles of democracy. And without that ethic of reciprocity, I think democracy is impossible. But as I said, this is not a theory of democracy, it's a history of democracy. And those are the ideas that came to me from the 25 years that I spent working on this book. I've been criticized by those who are not persuaded of importing into my history a set of normative commitments that don't grow from the evidence that I have, to which my response is, it's not true. These are the ideas that have emerged from a long and careful study and teaching of the people who have pushed democracy forward over a very long period of time. Now, we can argue about how to understand those principles and those pillars and whether or not they are as essential as I contend that they are, but I do insist that they come from the study of history and not simply from my trying to project onto the historical record my own convictions. Well, the history of democracy as I conceive of it up through the end of the 19th century is a history in 5 parts, and I'm not going to spend as much time on the first 2 of them because democracy is fairly thin on the ground in those first 2 parts. Democracy begins in the ancient world in Greece, as one of you mentioned, in Athens, and it is so old that nobody knows where it came from. It's already referred to in the earliest text we have from classical Greece. And the assumption is that it originates in Middle Eastern, Near Eastern covenant codes in which a ruler and the ruled would come into agreement about what was to happen, and that expanded into the understanding the body of people would come to make decisions for themselves. What Christianity adds to that is the idea of brotherly love, the idea of human equality, the idea that we are all brothers under God's sovereign rule. That idea was something revolutionary. It's not particular necessarily to Jesus Christ because the Rabbi Hillel was making a similar argument at roughly the same time, but up until that time it was very hard to find. And it is the singular a contribution, I think, of Christianity to the history of democracy to proclaim the equality of all humans. But that proclamation doesn't last long because as soon as Christianity is institutionalized, it's institutionalized in the Roman Empire, and it becomes something very different once it becomes official policy. It is the idea of equality of brothers and sisters is replaced by a descending notion of authority. That authority descends from God to the rulers and from the rulers down to the people. And that, through most of the medieval period in European history, is the way authority operates. But there is a counter trend. There's pressure against that starts as early as the 13th century, when a group of Dominican friars are charged with translating Aristotle's pagan texts. And they can't come up with a word that would be the equivalent to the Greek concept of self-government. And so they contribute to Latin the word politizare. And from that emerges the idea that it could be popular rule. It could be the people who make decisions. And so what develops against the authority of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor is the idea of an ascending kind of authority, an ascending kind of power from the people, which first emerges in a series of thinkers who are now known as the resistance theorists because they're opposing the power of the people to the authority of Rome. And this takes a number of different forms. A version of it manifests itself in Magna Carta in 1215 in England, another version of it in the Estates General in early modern France. But it first turns into something a little bit different in the Reformation, in Luther, in Calvin, and in the peasant revolts that are inspired by Luther and against which he turns fairly dramatically soon after they break out. That's where things start to get ugly. The peasant revolts turn into the 16th century wars of religion. And the wars of religion are so bloody, and they are so protracted that in response to them, a new theory of governance, a new theory of authority emerges known as absolute rule or absolutism, usually royal absolutism. That's the theory that's offered by Jean Bodin, by Thomas Hobbes, and that becomes widely popular throughout Europe as a way of putting a lid back on the cauldron that had been opened up by the Protestant Reformation. So those are the first two parts of the book, the ancient world and the medieval and early modern period. The story really begins to pick up, though, in the 17th century, when a small band of Calvinists comes to New England. And when they establish towns through what is now Massachusetts and Rhode Island, they're not establishing what we would consider liberal democracy because they don't place much value on freedom, they don't place any value on individual rights, but they do call themselves, in their founding charters, democracies. It's in the founding charter of Dedham, Massachusetts, of Newport, Rhode Island, of Providence, of New Haven, Connecticut, of Hartford in Connecticut. They do not want to accept the legitimacy of any authority outside their own authority, except, of course, for God's authority. Those are the same ideas that prompt the English Civil War in the 17th century. The levelers, as they're known now in the English Civil War, were essentially radical Puritans. They believed that the same principle of a gathered community that would make its decisions for itself, the principle that animated those who founded those towns in New England, should be the principle undergirding government in England as well. The difference, of course, is that instead of succeeding in governing themselves, they ended up with a regicide that poisoned the idea of self-government in England for more than a century. But while the regicide paved the way for the restoration of the monarchy in England, in North America, in New England in particular, these little self-governing communities continued to make their rules for themselves. At the end of the 17th century, we have what is known to most Anglo-American readers as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is said to enshrine the rights of Englishmen. From my perspective, it's not really a revolution at all. It is a coup whereby a Protestant oligarchy replaced a Catholic oligarchy with almost no consequences for ordinary people. In North America, however, at least south of the Canadian-US border of today, the consequences of the 1688 revolution were profound. In 1717, a clergyman in Ipswich, Massachusetts, with the wonderful name of John Wise, wrote a book in which he declared that the democratical principle is the original form of government, and that all other forms of government are deviations from that are less robust, less appropriate for humans than is the democratic form of government. And that way of thinking about the vitality, the robustness of self-government is a way of thinking that develops throughout the late 17th and into the 18th century in England's Middle and New England colonies. So the irony, again, is that there was no particular value placed on individual rights during this period, but by putting in place the institutions of self-government without intending to upset every apple cart, these early settlers were developing the institutional frameworks and the cultural predispositions that made possible the development of self-government. The next stage in this story, and really what is the heart of my book, is the story of what happens in the 18th century. There you have the emergence not just of the Enlightenment, as we usually refer to it, but of several different enlightenments. There was a radical enlightenment of skepticism, of secularism, of anarchy from some people's point of view, and that was true, that was real. There were people who were opposed to all forms of authority and all forms of religious belief. But much more widespread were forms of what historians for decades now have been calling the moderate Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of the Scottish common sense philosophers, the Enlightenment of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, we know as the author of Wealth of Nations, which is taken as the Bible of capitalists, but he was much better known in his own day and for decades afterwards as the author of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He was a moral philosopher, first and foremost. And he believed that humans are born with the capacity to learn how to reason ethically. He envisioned what he called an impartial spectator, whom we imagine looking at us whenever we face an ethical dilemma. And there's something in us, that impartial spectator, something within the human breast, as he put it, that gives us what Jefferson called a moral gyroscope. Gives us a way of knowing right from wrong. And that's just part of what it is to be human. It has to be cultivated. It has to be brought into fulfillment by education, by practice, but it's present in all human beings. And it's God-given. The Scottish moral philosophers were, overall, with the exception of David Hume, pretty much conventional Presbyterians. And they believed that it was part of the glory of God that he had given us this moral sense that enabled us to reason ethically. That way of thinking becomes the dominant way of thinking in most of the colleges established in what become the United States at the end of the 18th century. And one of the striking things to me is the similarity between that set of ideas and the ideas of a person who is usually taken as being part of an entirely different Enlightenment, and that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Those of you who remember the social contract will remember that there is a part of the argument in which Rousseau says that representation is completely useless, and the example he gives is England. What he means by representation being entirely useless is there are rotten boroughs in England where the person who's elected is somebody who's never even lived there. There's a tiny minority of people who actually get to vote in England in the 18th century, and most of the decisions are actually made either by the monarch or by the House of Lords. And the House of Commons basically is not representative of anybody other than the gentry, the oligarchy. So Rousseau is ruling out existing forms of representation, including the form that was said to exist by the people of his hometown of Geneva, but he lays out instead a very different vision of representation in a preface he writes to the Second Discourse, in what's called the Geneva Manuscript of the Social Contract, and in the constitutions that he was invited to write for Poland on the one hand and Corsica on the other. In all of those texts, he admits that if you have anything larger than roughly the population of the people in this room, you couldn't possibly have a democracy in which everyone gets together. They wouldn't even be able to hear each other if you had thousands of people. So you have to have representation. It's simply necessary if you get past the size of a small town. When he writes a constitution for Poland, when he writes a constitution even for Corsica, that's what he has, is representative democracy. And he argues that the only way to find the general will or the public interest, what he distinguishes from what most people think of as the public spirit, because the public spirit for most people is what he calls the will of all. It's just the shallow, self-interested preferences of people. It's not the considered rational understanding of what's actually in the public interest, what's in the common good. And Rousseau's idea was to find a way to generate that public spirit, that general will, by causing people not to see necessarily their own shallow, immediate self-interest, their impulses, their instincts as their real interest, but instead to see beyond that to the way in which their freedom should align with the public good. In his treatise on education, Emile, he sketches a very elaborate process whereby the protagonist, Emile, learns to internalize his duty. He learns to love his duty so that he sees the difference between his impulses and what it is that it is both right and good for him to do. The striking thing to me is that this way of thinking that I would associate not just with Rousseau but also with Adam Smith permeates the language of the American Revolution. John Adams, who later becomes a quite conservative thinker, in the 1770s was a revolutionary firebrand. In 1776, he wrote a little essay called Thoughts on Government because he was invited to sketch out what he thought a framework of government should be. This becomes the plan for North Carolina, for New Jersey, for Virginia, and from those three, it eddies out into other states and becomes basically the template for the national government of the United States. In 1780, Adams is invited by his home state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to write a constitution for Massachusetts, which he does, and it's ratified by the towns. And after it's ratified, he writes to a friend, it is Locke and Sidney, Rousseau and de Mably reduced to practice. Locke and Rousseau. We think of Rousseau as being the statist, the person who thought it was okay to force people to be free. And we think of Locke as the theorist of rights, the origin of the liberal tradition, not this Rousseauvian communitarian tradition. How could Adams think that both of these are brought together in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? The answer is that he had in mind the same sort of internalizing of one's civic duties and one's moral responsibilities that Rousseau did. And that way of thinking about freedom as bounded by one's responsibilities, bounded by one's duties, is something one finds not just in John Adams, one finds it in James Madison, one finds it in the most important of Madison's allies at the Constitutional Convention, Pennsylvania's James Wilson, who writes the most important speeches he gave on the Constitution with a copy of Rousseau's Social Contract at his elbow. The same copy, the same edition of the social contract that John Adams used when he was writing the Constitution of Massachusetts. Now, after the French Revolution breaks out, these folks scatter. Madison goes with Jefferson in favor of the French. Adams goes in favor of the British and declares it anathema on everything French. But prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution, he didn't see it that way, and neither did James Madison. Some of you, if you took any courses in American political thought, will have read Madison's Federalist 10, which has been lionized as the classic statement of American political thought, because it is said to make the balancing of factions the goal of government. Complete misunderstanding of Madison as far as I'm concerned. The point of balancing factions was not simply because Madison was a hard-headed realist, although he was. The point of balancing factions was that through the give and take of people who have different interests, who have different perceptions, something emerges from the process of deliberation that enables people to see the common good, to see the public interest. That's what Madison thought happened at the Constitutional Convention. He didn't get everything he wanted in the U.S. Constitution, far from it. He wanted both the Senate and the House of Representatives to be elected by the people. He wanted the president to be elected by the people. Instead, we got a Senate with 2 senators from every state, the smallest as well as the largest. We got a president who's elected by the Electoral College, which allows the craziness of the election of George W. Bush and the current incumbent to occur. But that wasn't what Madison had in mind. In his first speech before the Constitutional Convention, he says we need a solution to the problems, what he calls the inconveniencies of democracy, consistent with the democratic form of government. Now, when he and Alexander Hamilton get together and write what's called the Federalist Papers, as Publius, a pseudonym they used together, in Federalist 9, Hamilton draws a distinction between a republic, good, and a democracy, bad. And by democracy, he means a direct democracy in which all the people meet and make the decisions as a group. Now, no democracy larger than a New England village had ever operated that way in North America, and nobody was clamoring for that in 1787. But by drawing that distinction between a republic, or a representative democracy, and direct democracy, Hamilton basically playing the oldest debater's trick in the book. He's carving out the central space for himself and then developing a straw man on one side, the direct democracy, the pure democracy, and a straw man on the other side. The anarchists, or the aristocrats and monarchists, also didn't exist in what was becoming the United States. Madison, a day later, when he writes Federalist 10, is boxed in. What he had called a democratic frame of government has now been redefined by Hamilton as a republic, and democracy has been ruled out as anathema. So this classic text that we are said to understand as the text that helps Americans understand themselves and the Supreme Court cites in more than half of its decisions in recent decades, is a composite text that is written primarily in order to persuade voters in New York to ratify the US Constitution. It's not a work of political philosophy, and it certainly doesn't conform to the way in which Americans were thinking during the years of writing and ratification of the Constitution. Well, this commitment to the common good, to the public interest in the United States as it is institutionalized in the Constitution, is going to, if it's going to emerge, it's going to emerge through town meetings, it's going to emerge through state legislatures, it's going to emerge through the Senate and the House of Representatives, through this process of deliberation from which Madison and Wilson believe something like Rousseau's general will is going to emerge. Just a couple years after that, of course, the French Revolution breaks out. The French Revolution is powerfully shaped by that very different Enlightenment that I characterized as the radical Enlightenment. And the central figures in that Enlightenment and the central figures in the most radical phase of the French Revolution believe that reason with a capital R can generate the principles of government that will be rational, that will be appropriate for all times and all places. They're committed to a kind of universalism that will simply not admit of amendment and will not admit of disagreement. So the French Revolution unfolds in such a way that makes possible what I see as the greatest blunder made by the Revolution, and that was the civil constitution of the clergy that was proclaimed in 1791. That required all Roman Catholic priests to declare an oath of loyalty to the Revolution, and which turned even that pretty substantial minority of Catholics who had been in favor of the Revolution up to that moment into its most intransigent enemies. From that point, the Revolution essentially becomes a civil war, and once it's become a civil war, it then involves all the aristocracies and monarchies that ring France, and it ends with Napoleon. Again, as the failed Civil War or the failed Revolution in England had done in the 17th century, the failure of the French Revolution puts back the further progress of democracy for a century. So that's the fourth stage of the argument of the book. The fifth and final stage has to do with the consolidation of democracy in the middle decades of the 19th century. Most people who know a fair amount about United States history assume that democracy comes to the United States with Andrew Jackson and his election in 1828, because that's the point at which the common man is said to have emerged as the most important figure in American politics. Jackson's opponents never accepted the idea that his was, as he called it, the party of the democracy. They called it the Jackson Party. And the reason for that was that they saw Jackson behaving very much like a monarch. He would decide whether Indians should be removed from the southern states to Indian territory that's now Oklahoma. He would decide whether slavery made sense or not. He would battle in duels against people who challenged his honor or challenged the honor of both his first and his second wife. From another way of looking at America in the 1820s and 1830s, it was his opponents, the Whigs, who, although many of them were blue bloods, were actually in favor of women's rights. They opposed Indian removal. They opposed slavery. They were in favor of universal education. From this perspective, Jackson's democracy is essentially a Herrenvolk democracy. It's a democracy of white male supremacy. It's not a democracy of all the people. It's a democracy of a certain subset of the people. When Tocqueville came to the United States in the early 1830s and wrote his book, Democracy in America, what impressed him most was not that Herrenvolk democracy of the South and the West. It was what he saw in the New England town meeting. What he saw in the New England town meeting, which he called the cradle of American democracy, was people coming out to town meeting and arguing with each other and spending hours struggling with each other to come to a shared understanding about how it was that they should do whatever they were going to do as a community. They showed what he called l'intérêt bien entendu, which is usually translated as self-interest properly understood, which is to say that my self-interest is not necessarily distinct from your self-interest. If I really understand what it is, I should realize that we're in it together, that our interest will rise together, or we're simply going to be at loggerheads constantly. We're not going to get anything done. It was this willingness that people showed to join organizations, to participate in public life, to be part of a community that Tocqueville thought was the genius of American democracy, and it was what the French lacked. The reason the French Revolution failed, Tocqueville argued, was the French had no experience with participation in government, and they did not think themselves to be sharers in a common project. They were either of the people or they were of the aristocracy. They were either Catholic or they were anti-Catholic. There was nothing that brought them together. What Tocqueville found was that in parts of America, in New England, in the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, that area, middle states, this sense of frenzied public life was what kept democracy going, made it possible, allowed it to thrive, and it required people not to think they were going to triumph over those they disagreed with, but that they had to learn to get along with the people they disagreed with. The reason, sorry about that, the reason that book has endured as it has, I think, is that Tocqueville was among the first to see how central what I call the ethic of reciprocity was in early American life. It wasn't just a question of politics, it wasn't just a question of law, it was a question of ethics, it was a question of a personal orientation of one's relation to the other members of one's community. Well, that Whig sensibility that I contrasted to the Jackson Party's sensibility is the sensibility that gives rise to Abraham Lincoln. It gives rise to the Republican Party that comes into power in 1860 when Lincoln is elected to the presidency. It's the sensibility that animates the Union cause in the United States Civil War. It's the sensibility that inspires the attempt to end the reign of white male supremacy in the South during the post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction. The tragedy of American history is that that sensibility was not deeply enough rooted to survive across the color line. It was one thing to secure these rights, to think of oneself as part of a community among white people, specifically among white men. It was a very different thing to imagine it extending, even after you had ended slavery, to people of another race. All right, what about Britain? If you ask most Brits in the 21st century, they'll say, sure, we're a democracy. We have a queen, but she's just a figurehead. She doesn't really have much authority. Parliament exercises authority, and we elect Parliament. So, yeah, we're a democracy. But then when you ask, when did you become a democracy, then it gets a little murkier. Was it with the 1832 reform movement, which enlarges the electorate from a tiny number to a slightly larger number? Is it later in the 19th century when the electorate grows a little bit more? Is it after World War I in 1918? Is it not until after 1945? When does it happen that England becomes a democracy? The point is, it's a continuum. The reason the book is entitled Toward Democracy is that democracy is like a horizon. It's something we approach, but we never, ever reach. Because it's an ethical commitment. It's not just the set of institutions. It's not just a commitment to a set of ideals. It's not only those cultural underpinnings. It's the whole package. And I don't think there's ever been a culture that has actually reached that destination. But moving toward it is something that I think one can identify, and that's what I think happens in Britain during the course of the 19th century. You could ask the same question about Canada. When does Canada become a democracy? Is it 1867? Is it not until 1982? When does it happen? It's happening slowly, different times, different places. It's a gradual process, but it is happening through the 19th and into the 20th century. In France, there's a series of revolutions, as any of you who've seen Les Miserables or read Victor Hugo will recognize throughout the 1830s. 1848 is a huge revolution, but each time they get put back inside the bottle. Not until 1870, after the Franco-Prussian War, is the Third French Republic declared and actually has some staying power. And even it is very limited until the period after World War II and the formation of the Fifth Republic. In the German states, in Central and Eastern Europe, one could argue there really isn't any democracy until it's planted, you might say, at the sharp end of a bayonet. First after World War I, briefly in Weimar, and then after World War II, when it finally sticks in the German states, but not in Eastern or Central Europe. So when people look to Hungary or Poland or Turkey, for that matter, and say, oh no, democracy is in terrible states, democracy has only been in existence for a couple of decades in those parts of the world. So to suggest that it would have become stable in that short a period of time seems to me a fantasy. Democracy takes centuries of cultural work to make happen, and it hasn't. That kind of cultural work hasn't been done in very many places. All right, I want to close with a couple of more formal reflections on contemporary democracy in the US. The wounds that opened during the American Civil War, like those opened by most civil wars, I think have not fully healed. The divide between the Confederacy and the Union remains the principal cultural divide in the United States to this day, the divide that continues to poison our political discourse and to threaten the ethic of reciprocity in the United States. If you trace the lines of the most vociferous critiques of the 21st century Democratic Party in general and of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in particular, they lead back to the Confederacy, to the tenacious defense of the rule of white men, and to the resistance to the legitimacy of the authority of the federal government. The Civil War had ironic as well as tragic consequences for American democracy. In its aftermath, the suffrage and civil liberties expanded in the North, but contracted in the South. Slavery was abolished, but forms of racial subjugation were reconfigured and reinvigorated in the 1880s and 1890s until the civil rights movement of the 1960s at last forced the United States to dismantle the regime of Jim Crow. My book, Toward Democracy, concludes with the argument that the United States Civil War had the same long-term consequences as the 16th century European wars of religion, the 17th century English Civil War, and the 18th century French Revolution. Like those conflicts, the Civil War in the US severely weakened the ethic of reciprocity on which democracy depends. It sanctified the liberty of some individuals, notably white men, at the expense of the liberty of others. Like all civil wars, it left a legacy of hatred and distrust that has made further progress toward democracy less likely, rather than more likely, even today, a century and a half later. Democracy begins in blood, and it comes to life only through conflict. In the Atlantic world from the 16th through the 19th centuries, when that conflict has taken the shape of civil war, it has meant, if not the end, then at least the indefinite suspension of the operation of the cultural underpinnings on which democracy must rest. I neglected to mention at the start of the talk, because I wanted to save it for the end, that my book begins and in some senses ends with Michel de Montaigne, an early 16th century French thinker whose essays are sometimes identified as the beginning of modern thought. Montaigne had a chateau east of Bordeaux, which is open. You can go visit it if you have a chance, and I would encourage you to do it, even though it's hardly as grand as the chateaus of the Loire that most North Americans go to visit. In that chateau, he put the watchwords by which he tried to live on the beams above his study, where you can still see them. He also had for himself, had struck for himself a medal. And on one side of that medal, it read, "Que sais-je?" What do I know? On the other, it said, "Je m'abstiens," or I restrain myself. Those two ideas, humility and restraint, along with autonomy and reciprocity, were Montaigne's watchwords. He believed that those were the characteristics, those were the cultural and individual characteristics necessary for anyone to be part of a regime of self-rule. The problem from his perspective was that that was simply too much to ask of human beings. People were not capable of that. And as a result, he was more inclined toward absolute monarchy than he was toward government. My argument is that unless we are willing to reconsider our contentment with absolute authority, unless we're willing to work to cultivate the cultural pillars on which democracy rests, then we truly are moving away from democracy and not toward democracy. The hyper-partisanship that we see in United States politics today reinforces the destructive tendencies towards self-righteousness, dogmatism, and intolerance that threaten the cultural preconditions on which democracy depends. The qualities I saw on that airplane yesterday: restraint, humility, self-doubt, a willingness to trust in the good will and the capacity of others to do what they should do, are the qualities that democracy requires, and I think they are as present here in Canada as they have been anywhere that I have ever studied. So I thank you for being here.